By the time the first rays of morning cut through the low fog draping Sunnyside, Elise Martin had already disappeared. The town was silent, the kind of silence that clings too tightly, refusing to let go. Birds stirred in the trees that framed the narrow country roads, unaware that a crime too cruel to belong here had unfolded in their midst. Elise's car was found later that day at the edge of an abandoned service road, her keys missing, her phone powered down beneath the passenger seat. But it was the quiet that told the story first, the kind of quiet that didn't come from rest, but from something being forcibly, terribly, taken away. She was 27, a teacher of drama and literature at Sunnyside Secondary, engaged to be, married in less than a week, a woman described by her colleagues as sunlight that smiled. She was the kind of person who knew the names of the janitors and the favorite books of the shyest students. Her laughter could disarm anger. Her kindness filled the smallest moments with warmth. But on that Sunday, the warmth vanished. Her last known steps were inside the school building she loved, a place that had framed her days, her hopes, and unknowingly her death. That was the story the papers would later tell. A young woman, full of life and promise, stolen days before her wedding. But beneath that tragic summary, other truths waited, complex, unnerving, uncomfortable. The truths no one wanted to believe, because Elise didn't vanish into a void. She was taken by someone already there, someone the community had seen, greeted, passed by in the same halls, someone who had been trusted with keys to the same building where Elise spent her final moments. Daniel Foster was not what the town imagined when they thought of evil. He was quiet, kept to himself, never raised his voice. A part-time custodian with thinning brown hair and a boyish face that hadn't fully matured into adulthood. The kind of man you overlooked because you didn't know what to look for. He cleaned the same classrooms where Elise taught poetry. He swept the same corridors where Elise once danced, practicing her wedding steps in secret. To the staff, he was a background fixture. To Elise, he was barely a passing nod. But in Daniel's mind, Elise was everything. And that was the problem. The story began long before that Sunday, but the ending had already started to write itself when Daniel saw Elise alone in the school the Friday before. She had stayed late, grading essays and preparing a lesson plan for her substitute. Her wedding was only 6 days away. Everything was timed perfectly. The dress had been altered, the flowers selected, the playlist finalized. She even brought in yellow ribbon to tie around the doorknobs of her students' lockers, a final gesture. Before she took leave, she was organizing joy, unaware that someone was organizing her death. That Friday, Daniel watched her from the end of the hall as she taped the ribbons and laughed to herself when they didn't stick. He saw the way her hands moved, graceful, precise, without fear, and something inside him clicked. Not like a plan, not like logic, but like a long-held impulse waking up. Something he had carried since childhood, masked under compliance, hidden beneath monotone speech and quiet hands. He went home that night and didn't sleep. He read about the psychology of brides. He searched for why some women think they're too good. He watched surveillance footage of other schools. He took notes. Then, the next morning, he cleaned the floors like he always did, smiling just enough to seem like nothing had changed. Elise's fiancé, Evan, kissed her goodbye that Saturday night. She told him she'd go to the school Sunday morning to print out the final lesson packet. She didn't want to leave anything unfinished. It'll take an hour, she promised. Evan offered to go with her, but she said no, it was just a quick visit. The building would be empty. She liked it that way. She found peace in silence. But silence, as she would learn too late, isn't always peace. Sometimes it's the breath before a scream. Sunnyside Secondary stood quiet that morning. Pale blue light filtered through its long windows, casting soft shadows onto the tiled floors. The school felt different on weekends, emptier, yes, but also vulnerable, as though without the hum of teenage chatter and echoing announcements. Its walls could finally exhale. Elise stepped through the side entrance just before 7 a.m. She wore a light gray cardigan over a cotton dress printed with yellow lilies. Her sandals clicked gently across the linoleum. As she made her way toward her classroom, she carried a coffee in one hand, a canvas tote in the other, humming quietly. It was a routine she had done dozens of times, But today was different. Today, someone was already there. Daniel Foster had arrived earlier than anyone would have expected. He had a master key and no set schedule. His duties came and went depending on repairs, seasonal cleaning, or requests from the administrative office. That morning, no one had scheduled him to be there. No one knew he had disabled the security cameras in the West Wing the day before. No one knew he had taken a wrench and wrapped it in black tape, hiding it inside the utility closet, beside room 109, Elise's classroom. What Daniel did understand was timing. He had memorized Elise's habits. She always parked in the same space near the teacher's lounge. She always entered through the side, never the front. She always made her coffee stops on Sundays before arriving. And most importantly, she always left her phone in her bag while working to avoid distractions. She'd once told a student, to Daniel, these weren't harmless quirks, they were vulnerabilities. As Elise unlocked her classroom, the hallway was still. Behind her, the janitor's closet stood closed. The shadows hadn't moved. She turned on the lights, placed her tote on the desk, and opened her laptop. On the whiteboard, her students' names remained from Friday's farewell activity. 1 word to describe Ms. Martin. They'd written words like hope, bright, safe. The last one said sunrise, a nickname she never understood, but loved all the same. Down the hallway, Daniel listened, not in a rush, not in fear, just waiting for the moment to be perfect in his own mind, waiting for her to settle into the familiarity of her space, waiting until the silence became thick enough to muffle a scream. At 7:42 a.m., Elise opened the printer room to retrieve her worksheets. At 7:43, the motion-activated light in the janitor's closet flicked on. What happened in the next 8 minutes would forever fracture the peace of that town. Later, the forensic team would piece together what they could. No security footage, no audio, but the pattern of movement told its own story. Elise's laptop left open, screen still glowing. A torn page from her wedding planner stuck under the door, a ribbon, yellow and crushed, near the mop bucket. The wrench found later, wiped clean, discarded behind the boiler. There were no defensive wounds on her hands, no signs she fought, but the bruises on her neck and the trauma to her skull would speak louder than any cry. Daniel didn't leave right away. He remained in the building for nearly an hour. He vacuumed the hallway. He erased the whiteboard. He replaced the mop water, not out of panic, but because this, in his twisted understanding, was order. This was how he stayed invisible. And Elise, who had once described him as harmless, maybe even shy, was now reduced to evidence, a presence erased by routine. At 9:06 a.m., he loaded her body into her own car, folding her limbs as though packing away a costume. Her engagement ring caught the sunlight briefly as he closed the trunk. He drove east toward the reserve, far from the houses and roads, into the trees where no one would walk for days. There, near a dried riverbed, he lit a fire and waited for the smoke to mean something. It didn't. It just rose. By early afternoon, the absence of Elise Martin began to ripple outward. It started small. Evan, checking his phone a little more frequently, expecting a text that never arrived, a call to voicemail. Once, then again, her sister's group texted her about last-minute decorations for the reception hall. No answer. By 3 p.m., Evan drove to her apartment. Her bed was made, her toothbrush still damp. A half-empty coffee cup sat on the counter. Everything suggested she had begun the day like any other. Nothing warned that she wouldn't return. Evan called the school, but it was Sunday. No one answered. He drove there himself, pulling up to the side entrance where she always parked. Her car was gone. He tried the door. It was locked, lights off, no sign of activity. And still, he didn't panic. Not yet. Because Elise was responsible. She could be anywhere, lost in a project, taking a walk, visiting a student, people like. Elise didn't vanish. Not here. Not in Sunnyside. That evening, Elise's parents called the local police to report her missing. Officer Brent Holloway took the call, noting that Elise had no history of disappearing or depression and was scheduled to be married in less than a week. It didn't add up. A report was filed. Her face was uploaded to the statewide database. The town's social media pages began to echo her name. By dawn the next day, Elise's car was located off a gravel service road near Merrill Ridge Reserve, a place mostly known for overgrown trails and abandoned sheds from logging days. Her purse was missing. Her phone was found wedged under the passenger seat with the battery removed. The license plate had been wiped down, but it was her cardigan folded neatly on the back seat that made the officers' stomachs turn. Elise never folded anything that way, her mother said. She was always in a rush, always tossing sweaters onto chairs, shoes into corners. This was too precise, too intentional. Detectives sealed off the area. A search party was launched. Dogs picked up a trail that led through brittle brush, past a grove of burned-out trees. There, behind a thicket of reeds and dry bark, they found the remains, not intact, partially burned, scattered, as though the person responsible had tried to make her disappear entirely. The town turned cold that day. The temperature didn't drop, but something inside it did. Sunnyside had always been the sort of place where everyone knew one another. You borrowed sugar, mowed neighbors' lawns, left keys under flower pots. The news of Elise's death unraveled that trust in minutes. Schools were closed for a day of mourning. Flags were lowered. Candlelight vigils were organized before dusk. Even arrived. But mourning quickly turned to suspicion. Whispers about who might have seen her last. Questions about who had access to the building that Sunday morning. Eyes turned inward. Daniel Foster was still working at the school when detectives first visited. He didn't flinch. He answered questions without hesitation. Offered an alibi built around errands and coffee runs. His uniform was clean. His demeanor calm, but there were things that didn't sit right. Security footage from Friday showed him walking past Elise's classroom long after cleaning hours. The janitor logs from Sunday had been manually edited, an anomaly flagged by a young IT assistant who said something about the timestamp didn't feel right. When pressed, Daniel said he had no idea. Maybe a glitch. Detectives requested to view his phone. He handed it over, smiling, then said, "Hope it helps," on it. They found deleted browser history recovered within minutes. Searches from the night before Elise disappeared. How long to burn evidence, how to break a human neck. And most chilling, what happens when you kill someone you admire? The silence that had cloaked the crime began to fall away. Behind it was something far more disturbing than anyone expected. Not rage, not revenge, but obsession, the kind that hides in plain sight. The kind you don't see until it's too late. Daniel Foster had lived in Sunnyside for 6 years before Elise ever stepped foot into her classroom. He had been hired through a custodial agency contracted by the district, and while most staff never remembered his first day, Daniel remembered everything. Every teacher's name, every classroom number, every time someone forgot to lock a door. He logged these things not out of duty, but as a kind of catalog and inventory of routine and opportunity. What unsettled investigators wasn't just what he did, it was how long he had been preparing to do it. Forensics later recovered handwritten journals from his apartment, pages filled with mundane notes about cleaning supply inventory, and maintenance requests were interspersed with rambling fantasies. Women silenced, women tied, women admired and destroyed. In these writings, Elise's name didn't appear at first. There were other substitutes, long-graduated students, even TV hosts. But eventually, around 6 months before her murder, a name kept recurring, E.M. To Daniel, Elise was more than a fixation. She was a symbol of purity, of beauty, of confidence he didn't understand and couldn't access. Her laughter had pierced something deep in him, not because it mocked him, but because it ignored him. That's what he couldn't bear, the indifference. The way she moved through the world as if people like him didn't exist. Elise hadn't meant anything by it. She smiled at Daniel. She thanked him when he emptied her trash can. She once offered him a slice of banana bread after a student bake sale, but she didn't see him, not really. And for someone like Daniel, being unseen became unbearable. In his mind, Elise was no longer a person. She was a script written by the universe that excluded him. So he rewrote it. The timeline pieced together by investigators revealed an almost mechanical series of decisions. Daniel had visited the Merrill Ridge site 2 weeks prior. scouting it with the false intention of geocaching, a hobby he'd never taken up before or since. He purchased gloves and fire accelerant the following day. He had wiped his phone of location data, but not before cloud backups had stored his GPS trail. His actions weren't impulsive. They were deliberate, practiced, studied. The police were forced to ask, how many others had been considered before Elise? The psychological profile of Daniel was chilling. Diagnosed in early childhood with high-functioning autism and early onset psychopathy markers, Daniel had been homeschooled for much of his life due to aggressive ideation. A sealed juvenile file revealed an incident involving a neighbor's dog and a fire set in his backyard. But at 18, those records were buried. A second chance was given. He had no official criminal record when Sunnyside hired him. His calm demeanor during questioning unsettled the detectives. He didn't deny the facts. When told about the discovery of Elise's body, he simply blinked. "I thought the fire would take more of it," he reportedly said, not out of remorse, but disappointment. After his arrest, the town reeled. It wasn't just that Elise had died. It was that her killer had been allowed to roam their halls, work beside their children, drink coffee from the same breakroom pot. People combed through old yearbooks, staff directories, CCTV screenshots, wondering, had they seen something, missed something? And more haunting still, would they have ever caught him? If he hadn't made a single mistake, the answer was found in a broken shred of Elise's planner, discovered in the school dumpster. It had her name, the week's lesson plans, and one final note in her handwriting: Sunday, 7 a.m., last walkthrough, circled, underlined. Her own schedule, her own reliability. The very thing Daniel had used against her. The idea that predictability could be a weapon stunned the town. But for predators, it often is. Evil doesn't always knock down doors. Sometimes it waits behind one. Sometimes it carries a mop. The town of Sunnyside didn't grieve with words. It grieved with color. By the end of the week, yellow ribbons began to appear everywhere, tied around lampposts, braided through fences, hung gently on church doors. Yellow was Elise's favorite color, chosen for her wedding theme, meant to brighten the spring ceremony she never lived to see. Now it served a new purpose: memory, protest, refusal to forget. Her funeral was held 6 days after her murder, the same day she had been scheduled to walk down the aisle. The church she had chosen for her wedding, the one with soft white walls and stained glass dandelions, was filled with sobs instead of vows. Her fiancé, Evan, sat in the front row, a yellow boutonniere pinned to his black suit, hands clenched. In stillness that looked like stone, no one spoke about the wedding, but everyone felt it. Her students wept quietly in the pews, some holding poems they'd written under her guidance. One placed a note beside the altar: "You were the reason I came to school." Another left a small paper crane, the kind Elise had taught them to fold during breaks. That was the kind of teacher she was. She didn't just teach, she gave shape to silence, to pain, to potential. But the silence that followed her death felt different. It was heavy, not healing. And that silence began to crack under the weight of questions. Why hadn't anyone noticed Daniel's behavior? Why had there been no background screening thorough enough to catch his past? How could a man with known psychological disturbances, documented obsessional behavior, and past acts of cruelty pass through the gates of a school unnoticed? The district offered condolences, but no answers. The agency that employed Daniel issued a generic statement: "We are deeply saddened. We are reviewing protocols." But the town didn't want bureaucracy. It wanted responsibility. Elise's family, once private and soft-spoken, became vocal. Her mother took the podium during a town meeting, voice shaking, and said, "My daughter was not lost to random violence. She was lost to a system that let a predator blend in." Her words echoed through the walls of that hall and into headlines the next morning. Lawsuits were filed. An internal investigation was launched. Teachers across the region demanded better vetting, better mental health flagging, better everything. But it wasn't policy that haunted people. It was proximity. The realization that they had smiled at him, shared spaces with him, allowed him into a sacred ecosystem where children were supposed to be safe. Evan, unable to return to his apartment filled with wedding mementos, left town temporarily. He stayed with his brother near the coast, unplugging from news and social media. But grief followed. It followed in voicemail greetings, in the unopened wedding invitations returned to sender, in the silence between breaths. He later said that it wasn't the murder that kept him awake. It was how perfectly ordinary everything felt before. That a week before he'd held her hand, and a week later he was identifying her by a dental record. Back at the school, Elise's classroom remained untouched. Students left messages on the whiteboard, which administrators refused to erase. A yellow scarf hung from her chair. Her desk remained cluttered with lesson plans and sunflower-shaped paper clips. It became a shrine not just to her memory, but to a question. How could something like this happen here? The answer, painful and unavoidable, was this: it didn't just happen. It was allowed to happen, slowly, silently, one overlooked detail at a time. As the public grief evolved into quieter contemplation, investigators delved deeper into the chilling ordinariness that had cloaked Daniel Foster. The image they constructed was not that of a deranged man foaming at the edges of society. Rather, he had been disturbingly normal, perhaps even forgettable. He did his job, showed up on time, never made waves. His ability to vanish into routine had been his greatest disguise. The forensic analysis of his personal devices revealed thousands of search queries. Not all were violent. Some were innocuous: plumbing tips, microwave recipes, movie trivia. It was this blend that disturbed detectives most. Mixed in between articles about janitorial efficiency were searches like fantasies about suffocating someone you admire and how to get rid of the smell of blood. It wasn't a descent into madness. It was a parallel track running beside everyday life, a darkness moving silently alongside the light. Daniel had journaled obsessively, hundreds of pages, many written in second person as if he were addressing Elise directly, crafting a conversation that never existed outside his mind. In one entry, he wrote, "You walk past me like I'm not there, but I'm the only one who truly sees you." Another, dated a month before the murder, "They will remember me through you." A phrase repeated itself throughout the pages. Control is peace. Investigators came to understand that Elise's autonomy, her self-assurance, her place in a world that celebrated her, it wasn't just envied. It was offensive to Daniel's reality. Her ability to move through the world without seeing him became an existential wound. He believed he needed to close. Psychological evaluators offered complex, sometimes contradictory assessments. One described Daniel as a cold intellectualist, driven by obsessive ideation and a craving for dominance. Another found hints of narcissistic rage buried under years of self-imposed restraint. What all agreed on was this: Daniel Foster did not kill out of passion. He killed out of calculation. In his confession offered not in a courtroom, but during a videotaped psychological assessment, Daniel spoke plainly. "I knew what I was doing," he said. "I wanted the world to stop pretending she was untouchable." The public, desperate for answers, got something else: emptiness. The realization that sometimes evil doesn't come with motive or madness. Sometimes it wears a quiet face and waits for routine to lower the drawbridge. The school district, reeling from backlash, released an independent review. Its findings were damning. The agency that supplied Daniel had flagged him as socially atypical, but those concerns were never followed up. His early records, sealed due to juvenile protections, had prevented any insight into his dangerous behavior. And worst of all, multiple staff had expressed unease about Daniel in informal ways, uncomfortable glances, moments where he lingered too long, but no formal complaints had ever been filed. The report concluded with a haunting line: he was seen but not recognized. In response, new protocols were implemented. Background checks were expanded. Staff were trained to report behavioral red flags, not just overt misconduct. But none of it felt like enough, because none of it brought Elise back, and none of it erased the fact that her murder had unfolded in a place designed to nurture life, not take it. In interviews, Elise's friends often said the same thing: she would have forgiven him had he asked for help. That was her nature, to believe in redemption, in healing, in second chances. That belief, beautiful and unguarded, became her final vulnerability. The town began to move on in the way towns do, gradually, imperfectly, always glancing over their shoulder. But the building where it happened, the hallways, the classroom, the janitor's closet, those places remembered, the tiles where her shoes once clicked, the window where the morning sun always hit her desk, the silence that fell after. It was a silence that no longer felt like peace. It felt like echo. Time began to pass, as it always does after tragedy, though Sunnyside no longer measured it by calendars or seasons. Time was now counted in rituals of remembrance, anniversaries, dedications, headlines, and yet, in the corners of the school, Elise Martin once called home. Time did something else. It held still. The administration attempted a form of healing by reopening the school 2 weeks after Elise's funeral, but the building no longer felt like a place of learning. It felt like a mausoleum. Staff moved through the corridors in slow, deliberate steps. Students whispered instead of shouted. Even the walls, once bright with student art and colored handprints, were now bare, scrubbed clean in an effort to reset the space. But the absence only made the silence louder. Elise's classroom was left untouched by request of her family. A substitute was assigned elsewhere, and room 109 became a memorial cloaked in soft light. Her desk remained as she'd left it, mugs filled with pens, lesson plans open to spring poetry, a dried bouquet from a student fading quietly in a glass jar. A photo of her and Evan at the fall festival remained pinned to the corkboard above her desk. Corners curling, students left notes on her chair, folded origami hearts and cranes, each marked with a message. You made me feel seen. You helped me believe I mattered. You were light when everything else was heavy. But not all tributes were gentle. One student, a quiet sophomore named Mira, placed a single black feather under the door. When asked why, she said, "Because something good flew away and something ugly stayed behind." Elise's mother returned to the school one morning before sunrise. She was led in by the principal, who handed her the key and left her in silence. She walked the hallway her daughter had walked, past the staff lounge, past the lockers still etched with memories. When she reached room 109, she didn't enter. She sat just outside the door on the floor, her back against the wall, and cried for hours. Not loud, not wailing, just the slow, steady tears of someone who had learned to carry grief as a second skin. That day, a decision was made. Room 109 would no longer be a classroom. The district, prompted by donations from across the country, announced the room would be converted into a resilience and reflection center, a small, intentionally quiet space for students dealing with anxiety, trauma, or simply the need for silence that heals instead of hides. The initiative was supported by child psychologists, grief counselors, and Elise's family, who agreed to donate some of her personal effects to furnish the space. When construction began, a section of the chalkboard was preserved. On it, scrawled in Elise's handwriting, was a quote from Virginia Woolf, "I am rooted, but I flow." The line became the center's motto. Elsewhere in the building, subtle changes emerged. Security protocols were updated, yes, but so were less tangible practices. A new position was created, wellness liaison. Their job wasn't to enforce discipline or track attendance, but to listen, to notice, to act on gut feelings that might otherwise go undocumented. The district partnered with a mental health foundation to create anonymous reporting tools, not for tattling, but for concern, for subtle chills in the atmosphere that often mean more than outbursts. These changes came too late for Elise, but not for others. Within months, the liaison helped intervene into early-stage crises students who had written concerning entries in journals, staff members whose behavior shifted abruptly following personal tragedies. In one instance, a substitute teacher was quietly removed after staff noticed obsessive behavior toward a student. The system that had once failed began to show signs of awareness, like a wound knitting itself closed, not with perfect stitches, but with a hardened, wiser skin. Meanwhile, the legal proceedings against Daniel Foster continued. His public defender entered a plea of guilty on all charges. There would be no trial, no theatrics, no platform for his thoughts. In his final court appearance, Daniel spoke only once. When asked if he understood the charges against him, he nodded. "Yes," he said, She wasn't supposed to make me feel invisible. Those were his final public words. He was sentenced to life without parole. No possibility of early release. No media interviews. No notoriety. His name began to fade from headlines as Elise's rose. It was a reversal that the town desperately needed. National outlets covered the transformation of the school. Articles were written not just about the tragedy, but about the resilience. A photo of the newly opened Reflection Center showed yellow light pouring in through sheer curtains, a plush reading nook in one corner, and Elise's preserved desk standing at the center, not as a relic, sea of death, but as a symbol of continuity. One journalist described the room as a cathedral of gentleness in a world that often forgets to be kind. Another called it a space that teaches safety by example, not by policy. But the most profound review came from a student who had once failed every class except Elise's. She was interviewed during the center's dedication ceremony. When asked what the room meant to her, she simply said, "It means someone noticed me. That's all I ever wanted." Elise had once believed education was about visibility, about helping students see themselves clearly, perhaps for the first time in her death. That belief became her legacy, and her legacy became action. Months turned into a year, and though the media presence dimmed and public attention shifted to newer tragedies, the ripple Elise left behind continued to expand, subtle but unmistakable. Her name was no longer just attached to headlines or legal documents. It began appearing in lesson plans, in the signatures of advocacy groups, and in the words of students who refused to forget what had happened under their very roof. In the wake of her death, Elise's family established a foundation in her honor, the Martin Trust for Compassionate Learning. It was small at first, just a website and a mission statement, but its goals were ambitious: to fund trauma-informed education initiatives, advocate for better screening of school staff and contractors, and provide scholarships for aspiring educators with a passion for emotional safety in the classroom. The trust received an unexpected flood of support. Former students sent donations, often accompanied by handwritten letters describing the impact Elise had left on their lives. Parents from across the country, some who had never met her, contributed what they could. Foundations for Safer Schools saw in Elise's story a rallying cry, proof that empathy and structure were not opposites, but partners. One of the Trust's first initiatives was a traveling workshop series called The Unseen Student. Presented in schools across the region, it educated teachers on recognizing silent suffering, on identifying when quiet meant strength and when it meant something else entirely. Attendees often left in tears. The stories shared weren't just about Elise anymore. They were about all the students and teachers like her, overlooked until it was too late. At Sunnyside, a scholarship was created in Elise's name. It was awarded each year to a student who showed kindness in small, consistent ways, someone whose goodness wasn't always loud, but was always steady. The first recipient was Mira, the student who had once left the black feather outside Elise's classroom. When asked what she would do with the award, she said she wanted to study psychology. Not to fix people, she explained, to help them feel less invisible. While the school community rebuilt itself around healing, others began to dissect the systems that had failed. Education watchdogs noted that Daniel Foster was not an isolated case, but part of a wider pattern. A failure to monitor contract employees with the same rigor applied to full-time staff. Advocacy groups lobbied for legislative change, and within a year, two significant bills were introduced at the state level. The first required comprehensive background checks for all individuals working in schools, regardless of employment status. The second proposed funding for mental health staff to be placed in every high school in the state. Neither bill passed unanimously. There were objections, delays, debates, but the very fact that they were tabled and that Elise's name was invoked during the hearings was a kind of progress. Her story had become more than a personal tragedy. It was now a case study, a catalyst, a caution woven into the political and educational fabric. Her family kept mostly out of the spotlight. They attended the scholarship ceremonies, sat quietly in the back of the legislative hearings, and occasionally responded to letters from students and teachers. But for the most part, they let the movement unfold without claiming it. As Elise's mother once said in a rare interview, This is not about making our pain louder. It's about making others safer. Meanwhile, Daniel Foster disappeared from the public consciousness. No major interviews, no books, no podcasts. His request to give a televised statement from prison was denied. For the town, and for Elise's legacy, this silence was a gift. The story no longer revolved around him. It had shifted, as it should, to the life that was taken, not the hand that took it. At Sunnyside, a mural was painted on the outer wall facing the playground. It featured a flowering tree growing through a cracked stone floor. Its branches reached across the wall, bursting into blossoms of many colors. At the base, in careful lettering, were the words, "What she planted still grows." Students touched the tree as they passed. Some whispered her name, others simply looked up. Elise Martin had always believed that every life she touched would become its own kind of echo. What no one could have known, not her family, her students, or even Elise herself, was just how far that echo would travel. Spring returned to Sunnyside, with its typical rituals, exams, prom planning, yearbook dedications, but everything now bore a subtle undertone. The school had grown used to carrying its grief with grace. The way a tree bends to accommodate a scar on its trunk. Nothing had returned to the way it was. But in that shift, something more enduring had taken root. The Reflection Center, once viewed by some as symbolic more than practical, had become an integral part of student life. At first, students hesitated to use it. No one wanted to be labeled damaged or attention-seeking. But over time, the narrative shifted. The center became known as a place of release, not weakness. Students who needed a break from the overwhelming noise of adolescence found refuge in its soft chairs, its worn books, and its subtle smell of lavender and chalk dust. Teachers were encouraged to incorporate emotional check-ins into their routines. 5 minutes at the start of each class, just enough time for a student to write on a slip of paper how they were feeling. Not everyone used it, but for some, it became a lifeline, especially for those who didn't know how to ask for help until it was too late. Some students wrote about mundane frustrations, missed homework, friend drama, a breakup. Others shared more panic attacks, nightmares, the weight of being expected to succeed while silently unraveling. These notes, filtered by trained staff, led to interventions, not always formal. Sometimes it was just a teacher offering to stay behind after class, or a counselor leaving a note in a locker. Small things, but often those were the ones that mattered most. Outside of the school, Elise's influence continued to widen. A documentary filmmaker who had grown up in a nearby town reached out to the Martin family. He wanted to tell Elise's story not through the lens of crime, but through the people she changed, the lives she had touched even in passing. After initial hesitation, the family agreed on one condition: Daniel Foster's name would never be mentioned. The resulting documentary, titled The Light You Leave, aired on public television and streaming platforms. It was quiet, beautifully scored, and full of faces, not just Elise's family and colleagues, but students who had only spoken to her once or twice and still remembered how she made them feel seen. It became a national conversation starter, sparking panels and podcasts about emotional safety in schools, about the power of soft leadership, and about the cost of institutional oversight. One moment in the film resonated particularly strongly. It showed footage of a student orchestra performing a piece composed in Elise's honor, strings swelling under a mural of her favorite flowers. The camera lingered on the conductor, a senior who had once nearly dropped out, but stayed because Elise had encouraged her to lead the music program. As the piece reached its climax, the room stood still. It was as though everyone watching, those present and those on the other side of the screen, understood that this, more than legislation or architecture, was legacy, creation born from lost. The impact of the documentary was unexpected. Donations to the Martin Trust tripled. School districts in other states reached out, requesting guidance, and survivors, those who had endured their own versions of Elise's story, found courage to speak, not to shout, not to scream, but to tell the truth plainly, and in doing so, reclaim the quiet that had once betrayed them. Back in Sunnyside, Elise's family lived differently now, slower, more deliberately. Her mother took up gardening, planting a new flower each year on Elise's birthday. Her father, once quiet and inward, began speaking at educator conferences, his voice steady, his message clear. We don't protect children by watching them. We protect them by knowing them. They were not healed. Some wounds resist healing, but they were stitched together by a shared resolve. They would not let Elise's name become just another statistic, another tragic headline in a long line of preventable heartbreaks. They understood now more than ever that legacy is not the echo of what was taken, it is the persistence of what was given. And Elise had given much. In the years that followed, Elise Martin's name took on a quiet gravity. It no longer conjured just tragedy or headlines. It had become a symbol of unyielding kindness, of integrity uninterrupted by violence, of a life that spoke louder in memory than most do in sound. At Sunnyside, generations of students came and went, many unaware of the building's history when they first arrived. But gradually, they learned not through lectures or assemblies, but through the culture that had formed in Elise's absence. New staff were told during orientation, this place changed because of one woman. Learn her name, live what she stood for. Every spring, on the day Elise had once led the school's creative writing showcase, a new event took its place, the Day of Quiet Light. It was not flashy, no speeches, no balloons, no applause. Instead, the day unfolded in moments of pause. Students wrote letters to teachers who had helped them. Faculty left anonymous notes of encouragement for struggling students. Music played softly in the halls. Candles battery lit and lined across the windows glowed from first bell to dismissal, a soft reminder of who they were honoring. The event didn't ask for sorrow. It asked for reflection, gratitude, presence. By now, Elise's story had made its way into textbooks, university lectures, and educational psychology journals. It was taught not as a warning, but as a case for deeper empathy within institutions. Scholars debated the balance of privacy and protection, the consequences of budget cuts to mental health staff, the legal blind spots around temporary educational workers. But at the heart of every discussion remained one simple, inescapable truth. Elise had mattered, and the systems meant to protect her had failed. And yet, through that failure, something more enduring had emerged, not forgiveness, not closure, but transformation. The town of Fernridge, once known for little more than its proximity to larger cities, found itself transformed as well. Community programs sprang up, mentorship for at-risk teens, workshops on trauma-informed parenting, evening classes on emotional resilience. What had started as mourning became momentum. Even Daniel Foster's trial, once the focal point of public rage, faded into the background. He remained incarcerated, his appeals dismissed. His name, once burning on every front page, became little more than a footnote in Elise's much broader story. And that, perhaps, was the truest justice, not the silence of retribution, but the thunder of remembrance that excluded him entirely. Elise's parents eventually moved to a smaller home, on the edge of town, closer to the lake where she had loved to sit as a teenager. They no longer avoided talking about her. Instead, they invited her memory into ordinary conversation, her favorite tea, the way she used to correct grammar on cereal boxes, the journal entries she once read aloud on lazy Sunday mornings. Her absence had become a presence, gentle but firm. There were still hard days, anniversaries, news of other tragedies, sudden reminders of what they had lost. But those moments, too, were folded into the rhythm of a life reshaped, not erased. One summer, her mother received a letter from a young teacher in another state. She had watched the documentary, she had read the articles, she had changed her major, then taken a job in a low-income school district where she now worked with children whose struggles mirrored the ones Elise had quietly tried to carry. I never met her, the letter read, but I feel like I'm walking in the shade of trees she planted. The letter wasn't unusual, dozens like it came each year, but something about this one lingered. Perhaps because it spoke to the truth Elise's life had whispered all along, that the deepest change often comes not from loud revolutions, but from gentle, consistent care. Elise Martin did not live to see the change she inspired. She did not get to watch students find their voice, or schools shift their structures, or policymakers admit their blind spots. But she had started something. With every lesson plan, every compassionate correction, every quiet moment of noticing, she had begun a movement. And now, scattered across classrooms and campuses, communities and courtrooms, her legacy moved forward, quietly, unshakably. In the end, Elise's story was not one of loss, but of expansion, of what one life, lived deliberately, could leave behind, not just in policy, not just in memory, but in the way strangers chose to treat one another, not because they had to, because someone once showed them how.